politics and the extension of democracy, if this is what we see happening uh, in cyberspace, not just the growing constriction of internet freedom and open access to information and the ability to use the internet without interruption, but the growing diffusion and emboldening of government efforts to manipulate the internet through the use of fake news and bots and trolls and impersonation of legitimate actors and other things. I'm not going to steal the thunder of Adrian Shabazz, who's going to present the report to you on behalf of Freedom House. If this is what we're looking at, then we're in a very dangerous period. And one of the many things that is so sobering about this report is that it's not just authoritarian regimes that are doing these things. It's countries like the Philippines and India that are formally democratic political systems, but are moving in, at a minimum, in increasingly illiberal direction. I want to thank a number of people before we get started. I'll begin with my other four colleagues in the Global Digital Policy Incubator, our two new associate directors, Megan Metzger and Jan Ridzak, our consultant who's helping us with human rights and artificial intelligence, Roya Pakzad, our coordinator of many things who helped to stage this event, Sarah E. Zaldumbide, and all of our colleagues at CDDRL who also assisted us in putting this together. I want to certainly thank Freedom House for its leadership in this. I think this is the most important and systematic tracking of what is happening to freedom and integrity of information and expression on the internet over a number of years now, using, I think, a very good and responsible methodology, very transparent methods, and very uninhibited analysis, again, even of countries we think of as democracies. This is the second consecutive year that we've had the privilege of hosting what I guess we can call the West Coast release of the Freedom on the Net report. And Michael, we very much hope that maybe we can make it an annual event. In any case, I want to thank all of the other participants in this roundtable. You have the list of them, so I won't introduce them now, but they'll be introduced as they speak. And most of all, I want to thank Michael Abramowitz, the president of Freedom House, who I think has been a remarkable energizer and visionary new leader of this next generation of Freedom House's historic analytic and advocacy activities on behalf of freedom, democracy, and human rights in the world. And one of the things we see now is that human rights are digital rights, and digital rights are human rights. So, Mike Abramowitz, I want to give the floor to you now.
Thank you, Larry. And I want to give a big shout out to Larry and Eileen for your friendship and support for Freedom House. Both of you have been just stalwart champions of the work we do. So thank you for that. And I do hope this could be an annual event, at least while I'm the president of Freedom House. Most of you probably know what Freedom House is, but just to have the podium for a minute or two, just want to say a couple words. We're actually, now that I'm here in the middle of Silicon Valley, I say we're a 77-year-old startup. We've been around since 1941. And we were, for those of you who don't know, we were founded really to fight fascism, to fight the America First movement, the original America First movement, and to combat American isolationism and to really advocate for United States leadership in championing the cause of democracy globally. And we analyze the challenges to democracy. We advocate for greater rights for individuals, and we also support frontline activists all over the world in their effort to promote democratic change. We're obviously known, probably best known for our Freedom in the World report and now Freedom of the Net. Just a word I want to say to have the podium, because I want to put this in a broader context. Every year for the last 12 years, we have seen at Freedom House more countries restricting political rights and civil liberties than those countries that are improving them. And there's an increasing convergence of aims between openly authoritarian governments like China and Russia and anti-liberal leaders in democratic systems like in Hungary, like in India, and I think we also have to include the US as part of the global trends. And this is producing a powerful anti-democratic backlash across the globe. And I think, Larry, I think you're the one who's coined the word democratic recession. So, but we're in the third wave of democratic recessions. I think it's shallower so far than the ones that took place in the 1930s and the 1970s, but it's serious and it's something we're quite concerned about. And I think what we're seeing, and I think the importance of this report, is that the attacks on rights and the attacks on freedoms around the globe are really bound up in the internet. And our greatest concerns are also tied up in the way that the current technological revolution may enable even more sophisticated systems of repression. And that's what we're here to talk about today with our annual Freedom of the Net report. And it's a brand new edition. It's titled The Rise of Digital Authoritarianism. And I'm going to let my friend and colleague, Adrian Shabazz, who is the author, the principal author of the report, say more about the details. But I think the clear theme of this year's report is the growing recognition that the internet, which was once seen as a liberating technology, is increasingly being used to disrupt and undermine democracy, as opposed to building up democracy and destabilizing dictatorships. So we're very concerned about that. This is the 8th consecutive year in which global internet freedom has declined. Again, the US is not immune to this. The US is still free, according to our report, but it still has high levels of internet access, little censorship, and strong protections for free speech online. But we declined the US this year by 1 point because of the FCC's repeal of net neutrality rules. And we have other large and important countries like Egypt, Nigeria, and the Philippines that have experienced much more serious declines. And of course, China is, and we'll hear from Adrian, is the biggest violator of internet freedom in the world. And a lot of the report this year is focused on the efforts of China to kind of both increase its repression domestically, but also to step up its efforts to export tools of repression beyond its borders. So it doesn't mean that we're helpless today. I think there's a lot that we can do to protect the free and open internet and free and open societies that use the internet. And I really hope today, Eileen, that we'll hear some ideas. We have some ideas in the report itself that maybe Adrian will talk about, but you know, we're here at Stanford, font of great ideas. I'm hoping that we can hear some, have a good conversation about this. So Eileen, thank you again for having us. We appreciate it.
Great. Thanks so much. I just want to join Larry and Michael in welcoming everybody. Thank you for coming. As a former member of the Freedom House board, it is especially meaningful for me to have this opportunity to help host this event. We think of this Freedom on the Net report as not only a signature product for Freedom House, but really a very important foundation for the global conversation about the state of internet freedom, and a really important frame of reference for understanding the trajectory on digital rights globally. So very important. We have an outstanding panel with us today for this conversation. We are live streaming now. We're using the hashtag Freedom on the Net for those of you who are watching. I just want to start by saying we're going to organize around the conversation around the 3 core themes of the report: digital disinformation and its poisonous effect on democracy globally, all the different variations. Second, the consequences of unbridled collection of data by both states and the private sector. And the third core theme that we'll get to, that could have been the focal point of the whole conversation, is the rise of digital authoritarianism, especially the China model. I'm going to briefly introduce all of the panelists. We're going to start by hearing from Adrian Shabazz, the Freedom House Research Director for Technology and Democracy, who wrote the very rich introduction to this year's report. Other speakers we will then hear from in a roundtable kind of conversation before we open it up to all of you include Renee DiResta, Director of Research and at New Knowledge and Head of Policy and at Data for Democracy. She is known for investigating the spread of malign narratives on social networks and assists policymakers in responding to those threats. Camille Francois, who I've worked with on many occasions, is Research and Analysis Director at Graphica, where she works at the intersection of cyber, conflict, human rights, and technology. She was previously principal researcher at Jigsaw. Thomas Ilves needs no introduction. He former president of Estonia and really the global thought, which ranks first. Global thought leader on all aspects of digital society. And we are very lucky to have him here at Stanford with us now in a variety of capacities, one of which is as a very distinguished fellow at the Global Digital Policy Incubator. We also are very lucky to have Judy Estrin join us for this program. She is an internet pioneer who's worked with Vint Cerf in the very early days of the internet, former CTO of Cisco, led many startup initiatives, but she is currently CEO of JLabs and has written on various forms of digital authoritarianism. And I'm going to mention during this conversation, we will probably also turn back to Larry Diamond, who is deeply enmeshed in an important conversation about the role of China in this realm. So with that, let me turn it to Adrian.
Great. Is this on, by the way? Let's see. Okay, great. So thank you again to Stanford for hosting this event, and thank you to the organizers for scheduling it for nice and early at 4:30, which is still within my realm, coming from New York, so I'm not yet in my bedtime, which I appreciate very much. So what I'll be presenting to you today are the global findings of the Freedom on the Net report. For those of you who may not be familiar with the term internet freedom, it's the simple notion that the same rights that are held by people offline must be protected online. Each year, we work with a team of local contributors from 65 countries to assess how easily individuals can access the internet, whether it is censored, and how their fundamental rights of freedom of expression and privacy are restricted by both state and non-state actors. What I'll be walking you through today is I'll start with the improvements and declines of the countries that we cover. Then I'll go through the three global trends that Eileen has already mentioned pertaining to disinformation, data protection, and the ways that China is exporting digital authoritarianism around the world. And I will try very hard to close on a more positive note relating to what can be done to reverse some of the very alarming trends that I'm going to go through today. Here's a map of the 65 countries that we cover. You'll recognize some of the typical Freedom House colors of the map. Green are free countries, yellow is partly free, and purple is not free. Gray are those countries that we did not assess, but the 65 countries that we cover translates to approximately 87% of the world's internet user population. And you'll notice how much of the map is purple, which is unfortunate, obviously. But to give you a sense of what conditions are like in the not free countries, these are places where the internet is highly censored, where foreign and independent news sites are blocked, where companies come under very heavy responsibilities to censor political, social, and religious speech, where individuals, journalists, civil society activists are arrested for nonviolent views that they post online, and where there is heavy, unchecked surveillance of online communications. At least 1/3 of all internet users around the world experience the internet in this way. The vast majority of those are based in China, which again ranked as the worst offender for internet freedom in 2018, followed by Iran and Syria. On the other side of the spectrum, of course, there's Iceland and Estonia, which are once again tied for first place, followed by Canada, Germany, and Australia. And the United States ranked in 6th place, but declined 1 point over the past year due to the repeal of net neutrality regulations. And we've also noticed that disinformation and hyper-partisan content continues to pollute the public sphere, especially ahead of the midterm elections, where there's really been no sign of things abating since the 2016 elections. Interestingly, almost half of all declines over the past year took place around elections, which really underlines this notion that elections have become a sort of flashpoint for internet freedom restrictions. So in the year and months ahead of the election, governments oftentimes pass new laws around cybersecurity, hate speech, counterterrorism, that have very broad provisions pertaining to online speech. And then these are used oftentimes against political opponents, independent media, in order to silence speech and sway the public views towards enthusiasm for the government. Generally speaking, the two countries that had, I should say that the steepest declines took place in Egypt and Sri Lanka, followed by Cambodia, Kenya, Nigeria, the Philippines, and Venezuela. So some fragile democracies in there as well. And interestingly, the two countries with the greatest declines, Egypt and Sri Lanka, really symbolize the two sides of the coin of how disinformation and false news reports are harming internet freedom, which brings me to the first of our global trends. So on the one hand, propagandists and populists have really grown adept at using digital tools to manipulate online conversations and control the media narrative in their own countries. The number of countries in which pro-government trolls manipulate online conversations rose to 32 out of the 65 countries that we cover. That's the most that we've ever seen since we've begun tracking this in 2009. And we covered this phenomenon in last year's report, but what I'd like to emphasize is that not only has this practice become more widespread, it has really changed in scale as well and in terms of impact. Notably, we've seen violence being incited against minorities in countries like Myanmar, Sri Lanka, India, and Bangladesh. And it's also moved from open platforms like Facebook to more closed messaging platforms like WhatsApp, where it may be more difficult to spot and combat. In Sri Lanka, which shows one side of the coin, rumors and disinformation sparked vigilante violence that predominantly targeted the Muslim community. The inundation of hate led to authorities shutting down social media platforms for 2 days. On your right is a screenshot from Facebook. This was one of the false news reports that was shared on social media that claimed that members of the Muslim minority were stuffing, and food vendors were stuffing sterilization pills into the food that was being served to the Sinhalese majority. And there's also a video that you can find where there's a Sinhalese individual going up to a poor Muslim food vendor and asking, are there sterilization pills in this food, and kind of pressuring him to answer. And the gentleman didn't really understand and sort of was like, yeah, like whatever you like. And then this video was then used to incite greater violence and share this false rumor that somehow food was unsafe in the country. There was also this tweet from a government minister in Sri Lanka who stated that hate speech on Facebook is increasing beyond acceptable levels. And if you're wondering, like many Sri Lankans, what are acceptable levels of hate speech, he quickly walked that back and was like, I didn't mean that way. My bad. No hate speech is acceptable. On the other side, governments like Egypt are using the term fake news as a pretext to curb free expression in the country. Egypt is really one of the worst offenders in this regard, and that's why I picked it out for this slide. Authorities have blocked over 500 websites over the past year, including those of prominent news websites and human rights groups. They've undertaken a harsh crackdown on even mild forms of criticism of the government, as we can see from some of the examples shown on this slide. In the year when the hashtag #MeToo movement really gained prominence around the world, 2 women were arrested in Egypt for nothing more than sharing a video on Facebook in which they were talking about the sexual harassment that they had endured in the country and criticizing the government for not doing enough for protecting women's rights. And for those videos, they were arrested by Egyptian authorities and charged with spreading false information that defamed the government. Similarly, after Masal al-Arabiya published a translated New York Times article about Egypt's flawed elections, its offices were raided and its editor-in-chief was also arrested for allegedly spreading false news. And unfortunately, this is really only going to get even worse in Egypt. Over the past year, authorities passed a new law that requires all social media users with over 5,000 followers to now register with the government as a traditional media outlet. So we're seeing that in countries with some of the worst press freedom records in the world, they're now treating social media users like the traditional press. So it really foreshadows a greater crackdown that we're going to see on online media. Sorry. Ironically, it's oftentimes some of the same governments that criminalize the spread of false information that are guilty of propagating fake news themselves. After we saw the horrific murder of Jamal Khashoggi in Istanbul, it was very noticeable to see how Saudi bots and trolls were springing into action. There was some fantastic reporting about a troll farm based outside of Riyadh that was controlled by a Saudi minister, which has been very active in terms of spreading a different narrative around what happened that day in Istanbul, and also in terms of smearing all government opponents that are based outside of the country. And then very ironically, the public prosecutor that month issued a reminder that spreading false news can result in a 5-year prison sentence under the draconian cybercrime law. And of course, you can imagine what sort of chilling effect these sort of warnings have on online speech. That brings me to the second global finding on how demands by authorities to gain access, on demands by authorities to gain tighter control over data. This slide features a simple graphic showing just the scale of the problem at hand. It's become obvious to the public that as more and more data is being collected about us, it's harder and harder to secure. These are some of the largest data breaches that happened over the past year. The largest one is in India, which I'll talk about in the next slide. Well, really what we've seen is that as governments recognize the importance of data flowing in and outside of their countries, they're establishing new rules and barriers in the name of national sovereignty. So governments in 18 countries passed new laws or directives to increase state control over data, either by requiring that companies provide the means to decrypt their users' data, or by obliging them to store the data on servers located inside of the country. And this comes at a time where we saw one of the more positive things, which was the implementation of the GDPR, or General Data Protection Regulations, in the EU, which was a new framework for protecting individuals' data. At the same time, many countries are passing these so-called data protection laws that do the opposite of protecting data. In reality, they make it far easier for the authorities, often in countries with weak rule of law, like in Russia or in China, to then gain access to data without any judicial safeguards. And as a case in point, India, which is now proposing data localization laws, has this new system called the Aadhaar biometric database. And there was a breach in the system which left the data of 1.1 billion Indian citizens vulnerable to being exposed. Our third and final trend relates to how China is refining its model of digital authoritarianism at home and has become more assertive in exporting it around the globe. It's been interesting. This has been the one finding that's really attracted the most attention of the launch, which was just on Thursday, including by the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs itself. At a press conference, a journalist had asked a spokesperson from the Chinese MFA, had they read the report and what do they think about it? And interestingly enough, the spokesperson said, yes, we have read the report. And it's obviously just based on lies. It's obviously done with by an organization that has ulterior motives, as if the protecting of human rights is an ulterior motive to China. This graphic shows an overview of the so-called China model of internet control. From the very beginning that China introduced the internet in the country, it sought to keep it under very tight control. The so-called Great Firewall is an alarmingly effective apparatus of both censorship and surveillance. And this year saw the passage of a highly restrictive cybersecurity law that, among other things, requires companies to store data about their local customers on servers based within the country. What we saw was that Apple, over the past year, was forced into compliance with this law, which meant that it had to partner with a state-owned company, which was now holding all of Chinese iCloud users' data on their servers. And we can imagine how Apple, which has often portrayed itself as a very strong defender of privacy, when it comes to China, it's playing by very different rules. There's also been an alarming uptick in internal repression in regions like Xinjiang, where the Muslim minority is heavily surveilled using facial recognition technology and spyware apps that they're required to install on their phones, which allows the authorities to then look at all of the files that the Muslim minority have stored on their devices. And what's really new this year is that Beijing is investing considerable resources to woo government officials and media elites around the world. We actually found that in the 65 countries that we cover, 36 sent representatives to China for 2- and 3-week trainings on new media management and information systems. For example, media officials from the Philippines visited China for 2 weeks on a training that was, quote, on new media development and also socialist journalism with Chinese characteristics. Similar trainings have been held for senior media staff from 8 Middle Eastern countries. And it's unclear exactly what happens during these seminars. I'm sure they're fed very well and led on tours throughout the country. But we do know that when Vietnamese officials visited China in April 2017, it wasn't long before Vietnam actually passed its own cybersecurity law that bore a strong resemblance to China's own cybersecurity law. We've really seen that officials in Beijing are hoping to cultivate allies to follow its lead on global internet policy, and that the government is investing heavily in R&D and AI and wants China actually to become an AI powerhouse by 2030. Its companies are also now the leading manufacturers of telecommunications equipment and also of surveillance equipment in the world. We identified projects by either private or state-owned Chinese companies to develop large-scale telecommunications projects in 38 of the 65 countries that we cover. Much of this is part of the so-called Belt and Road Initiative, which is this $1 trillion development plan to remake remake the world in China's image. And we also saw that in 18 countries, Chinese surveillance companies like Hikvision and CloudWalk are selling facial recognition technology that uses artificial intelligence to identify and monitor citizens. Here are some of the countries where these 3 different dynamics are taking place. And here's a screenshot actually from a demonstration of one of these surveillance companies. And you can see that here in red, there is this box showing that this facial recognition technology is able to identify whether the subject is an ethnic minority or not. And we can see, given what's already happening in places like Xinjiang province, that these tools are being used effectively to persecute the marginalized groups that do not, let's say, that pose some sort of ideological threat to the Chinese regime. So I promise I try to end on a positive note. And this is going to be what we talk about on our panel: what can be done to counter digital authoritarianism and defend internet freedom. We've compiled a comprehensive set of recommendations that can be seen in the booklet, but and we have some bullet points here on the right. But I think at this stage, and especially after a presentation like this, it's really important to remember how the internet can still be an effective tool for deposing authoritarian leaders and rallying people to the streets for democratic change. On the right, we can see how digital tools were crucial to Armenia's so-called Velvet Revolution, when hundreds of thousands took to the streets. Digital tools also played a very important role in Ethiopia's prime minister stepping down and the relaxation of restrictions there. And digital activists in the Gambia played a role in pushing long-standing President Yahya Jammeh from power. And as you can see from this tweet, for a very brief moment, discussions about Jammeh were just as popular as Will Smith and Baywatch, which is no easy feat. So on that note, I'll close and I'll turn it over to the panel, where I'm sure that we'll have a very lively discussion about all these things. And if you do want to get in touch, here's my email address, and then also a reminder that reports on all 65 countries that we cover, these are very long reports that we spend a lot of time on. We have a whole team in New York editing these, as well as the graphics and data that was included in this slide, given that how small it appeared, is all available on our website, freedomonthenet.org. Thank you.
Great. So we're going to move now to the conversation with our panelists. And although these three themes really are interrelated and they bleed into each other, we're going to try to tease out some of the issues. So we're going to start by trying to just focus on the particular threat of digital disinformation. As Adrian has sort of just laid out, there are a wide range of different manifestations of this threat all over the globe. We almost need a grid to get our heads around the different variations. From, who are the primary malign actors? Are they foreign state actors reaching across borders? Are they domestic political actors trying to use disinformation as a political strategy? Are they patriotic trolls, digital mercenaries? Then there's another part of the grid you have to look at is which tools of manipulation are being used? Is it micro-targeting and personalization, or inauthentic amplification with bots and trolls? Are they open or closed systems? All those variations. And then there is the variability of the context. As you mentioned, many of these cases are happening around elections, where the disinformation is really aimed at either impacting voter turnout or manipulation of opinion or undermining confidence in the integrity of the outcome. Others are non-election contexts. It's just targeting of political opponents, dissidents, or trying to drive polarization and division, which tends to play to the interests of authoritarians. So there's all those different kinds of scenarios and different combinations. So I think we're just going to go around among our panelists, starting with Renee. I'll start with you and ask, what's your big picture take on this threat of global digital disinformation? Which dimensions would you call attention to or highlight as peculiarly ominous? And what do you think we can do about it?
Sure. So thank you for inviting me. I would say we look at disinformation as a deliberate spread of incorrect information, as opposed to misinformation, the accidental, since you were defining some terms. And the actor types that we look at are state-sponsored actors, terrorists, spammers, and ideologues. And those four those are kind of the four main buckets. And what I want to talk about is the fact that we see this as a cross-platform, ecosystem-wide problem. It is not unique to one platform. In fact, it's on every platform. Just today, we were doing some work on LinkedIn. And as a result, as one platform changes the rules, malign actors move to a different platform. And so this is sort of an ongoing whack-a-mole, not just across actor types, but also across platforms. But one thing that I want to talk about is a mechanism of manipulation currently quite prevalent in the US that's been quite prevalent for a very long time, but I think it really illustrates one of the challenges of talking about this problem as something that has a solution, as opposed to something that is going to have a series of kind of tailored responses. And that's the problem of coordinated activity in groups. And that's because coordinated activity in groups is something that's done by very legitimate organizations, particularly as you mentioned in your excellent presentation. It can be used to increase freedom in a society, but also at the same time, this is a dual use technology, and in the hands of a military or intelligence apparatus, or even a group of malign individuals, it can be used to do quite the opposite. And that's because it's really a function of the idea of sort of small world social networks, the idea that people, when they are placed into online structures with particular dynamics, tend to move in a particular direction. And I think what I want to focus on here is something that we saw starting back in 2014, 2015, in conspiracist and truther communities that spread misinformation in online groups and Twitter hashtags. They would work to acquire audiences, and they would use those audiences to try to impact policy, to win primaries, to shape legislation. So in many ways, this is exactly the kind of digital activism that one would want to see online, except unfortunately it was being done with kind of, in many ways, remarkable degrees of success by groups that traditionally are very, very small in kind of real world broad spectrum populations, but online, these groups of individuals really had a remarkable ability to find each other. And that's because that was in many ways facilitated by the platforms itself. So what we started to realize was that these kind of small world social networks, whether they be a Facebook group or a WhatsApp group, was that we were creating opportunities for like-minded people to find each other kind of independently of what it was they wanted to do. And this was the interesting challenge, which was once you have people in these groups, there is very little counter speech. There's very little of the type of open dialogue that you would see in a democratic society. So in some ways, the platforms were doing a remarkably good job at helping folks find each other through recommendation engines, through cross-referencing of accounts. And they were doing this not only for groups that we would, think of as working to develop freedom and a positive society, but they were also doing it for terrorist organizations. If you followed one ISIS terrorist on Twitter, you would be referred to other ISIS terrorists. If you followed one conspiratorial group on Facebook, you'd be referred into 30 others. And so one of the interesting challenges, and I think questions for the group here, and the kind of point of my greatest concern is, how do we come up with an understanding of what algorithmic recommendations, what algorithmic curation, and what an algorithmically mediated society with structures that are designed not necessarily for the facilitation of democracy as any kind of primary purpose, but just for sticking like-minded people into a group, what the impacts of that are, and how do we balance freedom of expression with the fact that these tools and these groups in particular are being used remarkably well by terrorist organizations and extremists to radicalize others in such a way that you never have the counter speech, because no one in the group is going to counter speak. You have the facilitation of radicalization because nobody is going to report the individuals who are getting more extreme. They just kind of go along with it. So what do we do when we have these structures, and how do we balance, again, the fact that this can be used for remarkable good with the fact that we're also seeing it being used for some pretty terrible things right now?
Have you figured out what to do about that?
That's Camille's.
Okay.
She's next.
Actually, before we go to Camille, I just want to ask one question. At the very top, you talked about this is really about cross-platform interaction.
Yes.
Can you just share with people what is a prototypical case of that? How does that work?
Yeah, sure.
Whether it's buying ads here and amplifying there.
So something I'll use Russia 2016 as a pretty well documented example at this point. You had ads that were purchased with targeting that was relatively sophisticated. Actually, the targeting was designed to drive people to a page. Once they had people on the page, there was the opportunity to proselytize to people on the page with some regularity. So they didn't have to continue to purchase repeated engagements with those people. They just bought the ad and then put people on the page. Once they had them on the page, people who were members of the page actually went and created Facebook groups that were fan groups for these pages. So then again, you had that sort of second level of interaction, that second level of depth with really the true believers, the true fans. You had the creation of events to get people out into the streets to see this, to take the communities that were built online and try to push that into real world activism. Oftentimes, one of the goals of these operations is to cross promote across multiple platforms. So you have your content hosted on something like YouTube, you have your Facebook page that is kind of the brand associated with that content. You have your Twitter personas that are pushing that content out to Twitter. And then you have journalists who are kind of the last piece who see this content on Twitter, particularly if they get it to trend. And then that in turn kind of crosses the chasm, reaches the mainstream. In the domestic space, a great example of this would be the Seth Rich conspiracy theory, which was kind of coordinated by a handful of people, material put up on YouTube, material shared into Facebook groups that were sympathetic, shared to Twitter accounts that were sympathetic, ultimately winds up on Hannity. And that's how one of these, again, it's the same pathway for information spread and transmission, regardless of whether it's a Russian troll or kind of a domestic group with an agenda.
Okay, great. Thanks. All right, Camille, how about you? How do you see this? What would you have us focus on?
Great. Thanks, Eileen, for having me. I want to start by saying that I'm a huge freedom of the net nerd. This is a report that I take extremely seriously, that I've been reading diligently every year. I generally also email Adrian saying, can I also get the data table? And because of my work, I do read a lot of sensationalist content online. I read a hyped up report that try to scare everyone. And this isn't the case of freedom of the net. It's a very rigorous, very thorough, very calm work. And therefore, Adrian, when I read your conclusion and I read, if democracy is to survive the digital age, as an intro for the last paragraph, I worry a little bit. And I think that, the conclusions that are put forth in this report are really conclusions that we must take a pause and sort of stare in the eye. It's indeed the 8th year consecutively that freedom is declining. One thing that's not new either is China is the top worst country. None of these trends are new. Every time they get a little bit worse, every time governments that we consider to be democratic governments contribute to making those trends a little bit worse. And that in itself, I think, is new as a threshold. I'm going to try to spend a bit of time on a trend that's an unfortunate one that I think is emerging strongly. And Adrian, you did highlight it in the report. It's on disinformation and propaganda. I look at the assessment and I see that about half of the country that were surveyed in the report have paid pro-government commentators that go online and manipulate online conversations. I look at the exact countries, about half of those who surveyed. I see some that I believe are strongly ought to be included in that list and who aren't. So I would go ahead and say that's actually a conservative assessment. That's quite new, having all these governments sort of having invested their own resources into being able to manipulate conversations. I think a question that, this gives us is, what are the harms? I think a first one that comes to mind for everyone is foreign interference. So unless you've been living under a rock for a little bit, you should have heard, about foreign interference. Renee, you gave us an example of the Russian campaign. That's an interesting one. It's very US-centric. We've been talking a lot about foreign interference from a US perspective. That's not, of course, the only country who is victim of foreign interference. Even in the case of Russia, when we see all this data about this troll farm, we realize that the first targets of interference here were Ukraine, that it also was heavily targeted Canada, heavily targeted the UK and France. And so foreign interference is much broader than sort of the very US-centric framing that we sometimes get trapped in, which is fair. It's midterms week, so we can do that. The other thing that I'll try to highlight is a trend that a few of us have been nicknaming patriotic trolling, which is a cute name for a quite dramatic set of practices. Patriotic trolling is state-sponsored harassment and hate campaigns. And this is when the governments that do have this ability, either in-house or purchased on the market, to go and flood online conversation, use it to directly target and silence dissidents, human rights defenders, journalists, and general critics. we've seen that happen a lot. I had the pleasure to lead a coalition of researchers who, over the past 2 years, sought to document instances of that. It started with a journalist, a French journalist in China. She was covering the Xinjiang region, and she sort of felt the burden of state-sponsored trolling as a result of her own reporting. And we saw this trend sort of disseminate across multiple case studies and across multiple governments. I'm highlighting this specifically because I think, Eileen, it answers your question on, let's try to have a grid, right? Sometimes propaganda, disinformation can seem like a very large and daunting concept. What's the difference between bullshit that upsets me on the internet and something that's a true human rights violation? That's a legitimate question for us to ask. And I think concepts like patriotic trolling, where we can say, well, here we have governments that are actively targeting and silencing and harassing journalists. That's a very clear harm under the human rights framework that we can then follow as its own sort of little bit of that problem. So it's also about isolating different bits and pieces of that puzzle that we can put back in the context of human rights and take action against. Patriotic trolling, as you know, many of the disinformation trends work also in a cross-platform way, exactly as Renee outlined, right? So I'll give you another example. When we looked at a government-coordinated hate campaign against a specific dissident, we saw that the government were using Telegram channels to coordinate the harassment campaign. And so the way this worked is people would join the Telegram channel, and then they would be shared targets, narratives, media, and links. So it could be, for instance, well, today we're going after this person. Here's their Facebook profile. Here's their Twitter profile. Here's a meme about them. Here's a series of narratives we're trying to push out. And here, what these troll armies are doing is, of course, two things at the same time. On the one hand, there's a clear focus on suppressing speech. I think it's also important for us to note that these troll armies are also used, for instance, to mass flag the post of the people they're trying to silence. And so from the platform's perspective, suddenly you have a journalist account that everyone says, oh, wow, that's hate speech. Sometimes it actually gets caught and it gets taken down before the platforms have time to investigate and realize that this was the result of the coordinated action and has been taken down by mistake. So there's a clear intent of suppressing speech, sometimes by gaming these flagging systems. And then there's a clear intent, too, of just flooding this person with extraordinarily rough threats, sometimes of sexual nature when it targets women, which I will say is more often than not. So what do we do about all of that? I think the first important piece is to document it, which is, again, why I'm so grateful for this report, to be able to say, we know that these countries have these specific capabilities. I think one thing we're lacking in this picture, because it's difficult to put on the table, is the market around these capabilities. Similarly to what we saw with hacking, for instance, the hacking into dissidents' accounts, right? At first, you look into governments who have the in-house capability to go and hack dissidents, and then eventually you realize that there's an entire market for it, that this is something you can purchase. There's off-the-shelf software that most of these governments use to do this hacking and intrusion into the target. It's the same thing for the disinformation and harassment space. So we have sort of a record now of which governments maintain this capability, and still, you know, we're lacking this sight on which governments are able to purchase this capability on the market. And unfortunately, a growing market. So the first thing that we do is we document, and then, Eileen, as you said, we grid things out, right? Which types of harms can we isolate? In which human rights framework can we place them? How can they be prosecuted? Which governments will take strong stances on this? Which platforms and companies will say we will not stand for this and go actively and shut down these instances when they happen? It's a lot of work that has to do between the academic community and the human rights and NGO community to be able to better document that. But I think that's a good start and something we can achieve.
Great, thank you. Who coined the term patriotic trolling? Someone you know?
I did, but with a lot of support of really good people, which I can all list.
Well, I'm curious. I mean, now we all know what that is. Was it even in the report last year? Was it referenced?
Well, not the term patriotic trolling,
But the
we weren't that
concept.
clever, yeah.
It's so interesting, back to Renee's point about the dual nature of all of this, is that, just till recently, we were all thought crowdsourcing was such a great thing. And now you
Yeah.
can just flood the zone with numbers. And some countries really have an advantage there.
Yeah, it's like crowdsourced repression.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Putin came out with the expression patriotic hackers.
Right. Thank you for that, because that's actually the joke, which I realized way later, way too late. This is a joke that only landed on a few nerds. The joke with patriotic hacking is, of course, repressive regimes would say, "Oh, I'm sorry that you're getting hacked. Those are not our hackers. Those are patriotic hackers. They're really doing this out of their own patriotic sentiment." Of course, it wasn't the case. Of course, they were paid by government, and this was this idea that because there was an arm length, we wouldn't be able to attribute it back. Of course, it doesn't stand anymore. In 2018, we're able to attribute hackers that claim they're doing this out of motivation, but in these cases, more often than not, are paid by government. And it's bringing the same thing to trolls, right? Most of these patriotic trolls are usually well set up operations that are directly funded and directed by government. So we also came up with sort of different levels of attribution for this concept. But it's the same idea that you can't hide behind a patriotic motive. This is, after all, a well set up operation that you can investigate and attribute.
Okay. All right, let's shift to Thomas and give us your perspective on this threat globally.
Well, thank you. Well, historically, as someone mentioned, I mean, everyone became enamored in 2011 at the Tahrir Square of the asymmetry between sort of single people doing something to promote liberal values against an authoritarian regime. It did not take very long for authoritarian regimes to figure out that, oh, well, if single people can do this, like Weil, well, maybe a government can do it even better. And so we have a huge asymmetry now, huge asymmetry between democracies and authoritarian states. The mechanisms that we've seen, which I've enumerated countless times, I mean, basically, you have hacking, breaking in, doxing, which follows from that, which is what we saw with Emmanuel Macron and with Hillary Clinton and other cases as well. Now we have bots that are not only employed by authoritarians, but they have political parties are doing it in the United States. You have trolls who are then both foreign and domestic. You have computational propaganda, sort of basically the whole. I mean, this ties into privacy. I'll talk about it later. But I mean, basically, Cambridge Analytica and analogous companies can, in fact, do micro-targeting and provide you with, well, basically something suited to you. And then finally, in the hacking realm, which is like different, but this is also part of the threat to democracy, is hacking voter rolls, which we know that, I mean, manipulating possibly, but we know that, based on who you listen to, either Jeanette Manfra, we had 21 states that were breached, and then Reality Winner, weirdly named Reality Winner, so basically 39 states, the NSA. All right, so that's in the US. My point is that it is, as you said, far too US centric. We need to look at democracies. The only country I found in Europe, of democracies in Europe, including some semi-democracies, the only country that has not faced one of these enumerated threats is Portugal. So far, everyone has had something or all of them. I mean, most notably, of course, Macron's election really went through the whole gamut, and clearly there was a strong foreign interference there. It is no longer just the Russians. I mean, the Syrians are doing it. Iran is doing it. And then we have our domestic willing accomplices who go along with these things. They may be suggested, as with the Blacktivist site and the whatever it was, the thing in Austin where you had the anti-Islamicists and the Blacktivist group sort of called together by the Russians, but then on a domestic homepage, like, okay, let's all meet up at that time at that place, which didn't turn out as badly. So I think that, I mean, one of the conclusions I've come to is that it is pointless to, first of all, rely simply on self-regulation on the part of these companies. The most recent example, but you hear these with the monthly mea culpas that you get from Dorsey or Zuckerberg. I mean, 2 days after the murder of 11 Jews in Pittsburgh, Facebook had a sort of a targeting group, sort of like promoting opposition to white genocide. I mean, it overlaps completely with the Nazi trolls and all of these things. And then they say, "Oops, we're sorry. This is not working. The whole model is wrong without some kind of regulation." So I don't know where that's going to go. I would say, in addition, that there are I think that they're fairly sort of dramatic things we have to do to preserve democracy. One of them, with the bots and the trolling, is probably rethink the concept of anonymity. I'm coming to the conclusion that anonymity and democracy are not compatible. Either you have one or the other, but the two of them will not stand. I mean, it doesn't have to be outright transparency in who's doing something, but you have to be able to figure out who is trolling you, who is putting up these ads, something that was resisted for a long time explicitly resisted by the platforms. And I see the way things are going. Well, okay, before I get the other thing, we have to realize that democracies have an asymmetric disadvantage. We need to use the asymmetric advantages the liberal democratic West has, and these are not digital. These are sort of visas. Do you get to buy property in Trump Tower or in Belgrave in London, or where there's no transparency? These are things we can do. I think inevitably we will end up with some kind of tripartite division of the internet between, say, the laissez-faire free-for-all that we have here, unregulated, then the opposite extreme, the Chinese complete authoritarian model, and then this kind of intermediate privacy respecting but nonetheless interventionist approach of the European Union, which we see with GDPR, and I predict all kinds of other things. And finally, I think I'll just throw out to think about, which is that one aspect of this has caught me recently, which is that we all talk about huge polarization. And the more I think about polarization, I've not seen anyone write about this, unfortunately, because I'm no philosopher, but the chief architect and generally considered smartest person, philosopher in Nazi Germany, a guy named Carl Schmitt, actually proposed as an alternative model of rule, instead of democracy, liberal democracy, politics as the friend-enemy distinction. And now that has really struck me in the last month or two, looking at the way the political dialogue before these elections, but I see it all over Europe, is that basically whoever's the opposition is the enemy, must be destroyed. I mean, be you a liberal or whatever it is. And I think we need to look at these things from that perspective, because sort of the Carl Schmitt view of politics is not something I think democracies can handle.
Yep, definitely not. A lot more about the rhetorical tricks and how that works. So we'll come back to you on the computational propaganda when we're going to go. I'm going to hear from Judy next, and then we'll come back to you on that. But this point about the bizarre mix between foreign and domestic disinformation and how you tease that apart, I think is really important, as well as understanding the global picture rather than focusing solely on the U.S. That said, it is the eve of our election, our midterm, so we are justifiably preoccupied. There it is. All right, so Judy, how about you?
So when Eileen invited me, I said I didn't belong on this panel initially and the reason she invited me is I just voiced some of my concerns that I've been having over the last couple of years in a piece that I titled Authoritarian Technology. And so the matching was authoritarian, but it's not digital authoritarianism that you guys talk about. It's actually the opposite. It's the technology that is being the authoritarian. So I told Eileen that I would come and give some counter perspectives. I'm going to zoom out for a couple minutes. I want to preface this by, don't take anything I'm saying to reflect on, I don't think this work is critical, important, necessary, not sufficient. And so that's why I just wanted to come and poke a little, because what I'm trying to do now, Eileen mentioned I was involved. I was a Stanford student in '75 working with FinSurf on the TCP protocols. So I was involved and then helped build the networking industry. I helped create all this, and I'm in despair now for what these technologies are doing to our democracy and our society. And the oops, we broke it, that move fast and break things. Well, this one, the things we're breaking, we can't just say oops. So I'm trying to lend my voice where I can to zoom out and understand some of these issues. And I see this as a challenge. We've always had to deal with progress and the consequences of progress. We have a grand challenge now in the consequences of industrial pollution in our climate. Well, this is equal to that in the task we need collectively to figure out how to solve, because it is impacting us in a different way. But in some ways, it's harder, even though what could be harder than climate, in that it's not clear byproducts. The byproducts are not separated from the actual intended use. And both Renee and Camille alluded to those. And so it's not as easy. It's not just a question of here's lead or here's carbon emissions, here are pollutants, and what are the trade-offs? It's sometimes you can't even separate out the hate speech from this free expression. Or if you try to get rid of the hate speech, you get rid of free expression. So the solutions are whether it's trade-offs of convenience and privacy, hate speech and free expression, democratization versus authoritarianism, which you so aptly point out in your report, user desires, wants, needs, and harm. Those four things. Do we give people what they want in their heads, they desire in their unconscious, what is actually good for them? All of those things converge in this being a consumer product that is harder to deal with than other aspects of industrialization. And so why do I say this? You have to look beyond, we're talking about digital disinformation because it is impacting democracy. Well, we have to look at not just the explicit operations that were talked about here in the manipulation, but the intended use of these digital services. And I'm not even talking about the manipulation of the intended use. I'm talking about when you blend news, information, and entertainment into feeds, and you combine that with personalization and micro-targeting, how does that disrupt and break things that actually democracy depends upon? And we talk about the information that is important for democracy, but I would just bring up three additional areas that are harder to measure, but we have to be thinking about. One is fragmentation. The fragmentation of information, because you are no longer going to a site, you don't have the context, things come at you, you don't even really know necessarily where they originated and where they come from. You have a fragmentation that creates a loss of context. When you have a loss of context, context is what helps you decide who or what to trust, who to mistrust. You also lose a shared reality, because the micro-targeting and the fragmentation means we get different pieces of information, and it goes beyond just filter bubbles to just to complete alt reality and not knowing even the context that the person you're talking to is operating off of. We've talked a lot about, and I think more familiar to everybody, is the amplification of outrage and hate. That is fundamentally built into the design of these products, the business model of these products. How does that impact our ability to debate? Ability to debate is part of a democracy. And one thing that I was thinking about the other day, there's a term that people use, low information voters. Well, have we all become low information voters? We have all of this information, but I'm not sure we are integrating them and have the context. So it dramatically changes how we're making the decisions. And then deeper is that today's technologies, I believe, are impacting the development of critical thinking, our personal authority, the blind trust dynamic we have with these technologies. And the reason why this is so important is it makes us more susceptible to authoritarian control. And I say us because you could say it's a certain set of people, but to some level, we are all being impacted by these technologies. And it is, I think it's just really important as we focus in, which is critical. We need people who are focusing in on disinformation or focusing in on how governments are manipulating and using this information. We also have to zoom out and realize what is happening to us as a society and people, because that is really what makes up democracy. And if anything, we know there is just such a heavy psychological, complicated components that make democracies work. They're hard. They are not easy. And at the core of this, one thing I realized I left off my list is that this desire to make everything so easy, instantaneous, the elimination of friction, I would argue, is at odds with a working liberal democracy. Democracies are by definition hard and require friction. Authoritarianism, frankly, is a lot easier, but not, I don't think, where we all want to be. So looking forward, I thought I'd suggest 3 things that we ought to at least be thinking about. I'm not good at simple solutions, but I'll throw out 3 things that we ought to be thinking about. One is that, and this is something that I react to because I helped build the internet. Facebook is not the internet. Google is not the internet. But it's what we think of when we think the internet today. When the World Wide Web Foundation talks about getting the internet to everybody, it's no longer the internet of the web. It is Facebook, it is Twitter, it is Google. And I think that actually we need to start, as we're looking at solutions, to separate out the concept of the internet and the web and the original concepts of that information from the abusive behaviors of the internet the abusive behaviors of some of the applications and services on top of the internet infrastructure. So what am I talking about? Talking about addictive services, games, and applications. I'm talking about predictive AI that takes the level of recommendation engines and personalization and micro-targeting to a place where it can be manipulated and is impacting our thinking. I'm talking about the amplification of outrage, the yelling in a crowded room. Maybe I'm talking about the unfettered user-generated content. Maybe there is a model where not everything should be able to be put on, available to everybody instantaneously. Broadcast TV, we have a 10-second delay. So, and that isn't the model. I'm just showing we've now assuming that there needs to be a level of frictionless. I'm not naive. We may not be able to go backwards, but let's at least ask ourselves these questions. And I moderated a filming of the documentary, The Cleaners, the other day, which is many of you may have seen. It's an amazing documentary, but I came away from it. One, it just shows the complexity. You want to know who's being harmed there. Everybody's being harmed. But it made me think about, is the whole emphasis on content moderation the clean coal of this problem? Is that, it's a short-term answer. I'm not sure it's the right-term answer. And I really think we need to think about the structure of these services. Second, there are a couple of things we have to get ahead of. So yes, we need to be understanding bots and trolls and all of how all of this has been done. If we don't, and it may be too late, but if we don't get further ahead about deep fake technology, which is the ability to create audio and video that you don't know what is true. I don't know if you can't eliminate it totally. We're past that. But if we don't figure out how to regulate that and slow it down, we get to a place where you really cannot trust what you believe or what you see, what you believe. And the second is the Internet of Things and the appliances. In terms of appliances, medical devices, cars, in our bodies, the security and surveillance aspects of that technology just goes a step further beyond where we are today. And so we need to make sure that we're looking forward at those technologies. And last, this I think is the meta question: who's making these decisions for society? And right now we're looking at Facebook and Google, and Twitter, critical to making the decisions with us. But we as a society need to be figuring out our future. And there is either thinking that it's too complicated, a technological optimism that everything is good, or a technological inevitability, which is why I named my piece Authoritarian Technology, because we are in a controlling relationship, a bullying, controlling, authoritarian, blind trust relationship with technology overall. And whether it's as users, as academics, as policymakers, as citizens, we need to be on an equal footing. That doesn't mean these services go away. It means we need to have an equal footing of debate, and we need collective governance mechanisms. Right now, and the one problem I have with the report is it's either heavy-handed governments that make the decision or heavy-handed technology companies. So either leave them alone or governance. We need governance, but not a single institution doing it. It needs to be balanced and collective. The services today are simply too big and consolidated to manage. I'm not making even a comment on the companies, which I will if you want, but the services are too big, complicated, integrated to be safe. So I'll end on that. Otherwise, I'll just
That's awesome. I have to ask a follow-up, and then we've got two other buckets, but we're going to actually move to the audience just to see if there are questions, people live here. Everything you're talking about, authoritarian tech, where we cede our human agency, the loss of context, loss of shared reality, all those things. For me, it begs the question of the role of civic education and whether there's potency there or not. And I will connect it to this challenge of deep fakes. The Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity, actually, Tomas and I are on together with a number of other people, and Michael Chertoff is the chair. He's the chair of Freedom House Board. We have a project where we are trying to work with technologists who have detection capabilities that are on the leading edge, but we want to use it to build a civic education platform to sort of get ahead of the curve and get the public involved in the extent of manipulation. Are you optimistic that can work?
So let me say that one of the things that I think we absolutely need is digital literacy but age appropriate. I think we should have age appropriate digital literacy starting from when you enter school all the way through. That needs to be the equivalent of sex education or driver's ed, where you don't just learn how to use the technology, you learn the dangers of the technology. And so I do think, and I do believe that I am concerned with the deep fake technology that we have to try. We're going to have fits and starts, and I don't think it's going to be 100%. But that doesn't mean you don't do it. Yeah. My concern, though, is I don't I don't start with that because I don't want us collectively to put all of the burden on the individual and future generations. The same way, I personally don't like that all the burden of eating healthy is on reading the food label and trying to make a decision. I think we should be changing our food system. So I think that I think it's really easy, given the way we operate today, to kind of say, okay, let's train people to be more critical and understand this. It's not enough. And also because unless we want to get to a world, and this may be true, that you just don't believe anything online. And you could just decide that all information that you're getting online should be discounted. Then it's just hard to see how democracy is actually going to work in that environment.
Right.
So I think there's a hope.
Yeah. Yeah. Camille, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, can I share a fun deepfakes story? So,
is it going to depress us more?
No, I think it's fun. So my partner teaches media-related studies, and one day he came home and he said, I have a great idea. I'm going to teach the kids how to deepfake. And I said, honey, this sounds like a terrible idea. Please don't do that. He never says what I do. So, of course, he went ahead and did it. In the first session they read all these reports on how deepfakes was going to be the end of democracy and everything was going to be terrible. And then they also went ahead and they realized how much of that is readily available, right? How much of the data that you would need to do deepfakes is there? How much of the open source packages and machine learning systems are there available and in free software? And they sort of like looked at both and were like, wow, this is both the impending doom of democracy and totally available at our fingertips. And then they started using it in deepfaking. And then after a few sessions, everyone was like, well, actually, now we have a better grasp on the technology. We see very clearly where the current technologies is falling short. They all had very specific ideas on which faces were hard to deepfake because of glasses. And like they had like this very specific ideas. And I think sort of leaning into those technologies that we sometimes fear for the good reasons, right? When they're all available is also going to be important, right? So all of this is available. Let's make sure that everyone, including kids, know how to use that. And I think this will build media literacy. I do realize this is not a popular opinion.
I was just going to say, I'll just register and we can, I love everything you're saying. I completely disagree with that.
So this is free speech.
Yeah. And I think that if you project out where this technology is going, that there are certain things that you just don't want to let out of the bag. And
but it is.
Yeah.
But so then we need to adapt our democracy and adapt society to it, not yeah. So I'm not saying don't teach people that it's there.
Yeah.
But to accept it and assume that then it's not going to be used is the part. Everything up to that's going to save us.
We already see misinformation campaigns around deepfakes without the deepfake actually being created. Why am I echoing here? And by that I mean, you go into President Trump's tweets, you'll periodically see there was a period of time. I don't know why I'm echoing here. I'm sorry. There was a period of time where he would say, this was right around the time when he was expressing doubt about whether he had made the Pussygate comments. And there were some of his supporters, including Jacob Wohl, who's recently, risen to a new level of online prominence, talking about how it was all Adobe Voco. It was all a forgery. And so the mere fact that the technology exists allows people to claim that what is real is not real. And I actually don't see that technology as being really net beneficial. I have a hard time thinking of the benefit of it. And I think that one of the challenges of the Valley is a very long history of saying, can we, but not should we? And that's where I think, as we think about democracy, getting a handle on, yes, we have to educate people that these technologies exist, but I don't think that's as simple as developing a media literacy, program for schools. We hear that a lot as a solution. When in reality, it's actually much older people that have much more significant media literacy challenges and will continue to, particularly as this technology evolves. I don't know how we reach them. That's never discussed really. And so the idea of media literacy is advanced as this kind of cure-all, but the the specifics never seem to get fully fleshed out.
All right, we're quickly running out of time here. We definitely have to get to the China model of digital authoritarianism to do justice to this report. And Larry's going to share that. I also would love to hear from Tomas about computational propaganda and data protection. And so I don't know.
I'll do it very quickly.
Yeah.
I very much like Judy Estrom's idea. We need to be on an equal footing because, in fact, this is another huge asymmetry, which is an asymmetry of privacy and of transparency between platforms and users, or in the case of democracy, between platforms and citizens. Platforms today maintain a complete lack of transparency, or in fact, they maintain a huge degree of privacy regarding algorithms, how algorithms function, what they are looking for. They are not at all open to the public. They're closed when it comes to who their clients are. They were until a hue and cry was raised only last year about who their advertisers are, because I mean they in fact did not conform to the FEC regulation on transparency of who was advertising. Whereas the users on the hand have no privacy because virtually every search you undertake or every page you look at is monetized as data sold for someone. Each search basically that you ever make is yet another data point. And I think again, this is where too much of our energy is focused on what Yevgeny Morozov calls solutionism, which is, oh, there must be a technical fix. I think that there are things that there's too much for a technical fix. We may have to reorganize democracy. I mean, that's what as I said before, maybe first past the post elections have outlived their usefulness because that just drives polarization. You end up with two-party systems that start demonizing each other. As I said earlier, also anonymity should not be allowed to advertisers, to whom the fact who is getting the information you have, who's paying for the ads. And so we have to go beyond an IT-centered solution and think about what it is that we need to do to maintain the principles of democracy without necessarily using the mechanisms that basically date back to the 18th century when none of this was a problem. So, I mean, this requires, I think, a new Lockean contract where the government actually has to rethink how it does things in order to preserve the fundamental way of doing things. I mean, the Electoral College was designed in order to get candidates to campaign outside of New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, which were the large states. So you gave this, I mean, you gave, in the horse and carriage era, you retrain, you gave, sort of a boost to the little states so they wouldn't be left out. That's not needed anymore. And again, Kate Jamison's book that came out, a month ago shows that basically you focus on those states that have an inordinate clout in elections, and there have been counties even that have an inordinate clout. So that's how others can manipulate our elections. So I mean, what we have to do is think beyond just, what are we going to make Facebook do? Yeah, I mean, there are things you can make Facebook do, but there are things that, we just have to rethink, perhaps make our system more egalitarian or at least more equal. We have to get to a point, I believe, we have to get to the point where you actually have no one getting 50% of the vote, and you force coalitions, which drives toward the center rather than what we've seen in Hungary and Poland and now here, a drive toward the extremes. Which is, of course, sort of additionally assisted, as it were, by the primary notion where you only have two parties and in order to get your base, you get more radical and less willing to cooperate. So, I mean, that's why I think that we have to rethink the whole mean, you have to go beyond the technology.
Yep.
Based on recognizing the vulnerabilities that democracy has, and then start tweaking the system as well.
Go ahead.
May I just say a brief comment to transition
Great.
to Larry?
Excellent.
I think that the underlying thing that I've heard a lot is that somehow we haven't kept up with advances in technology, that democracies have done a very bad job to adapt to modern technology, how it makes open societies vulnerable. And, you know, we used to dream about how the internet would make us more democratic, you know, it would bring direct democracy. We'd all be voting on our phones about every local issue, and how far we've gone from that ideal. And then I think, and what Judy was saying around the internet as well, I think that the internet was not designed to be used in the manner that it's being used today. I mean, when the technical standards around how traffic moves around the internet were developed, in many cases, that was even before China had introduced the internet in a meaningful way. And I feel like on the other side of the spectrum, there is China, which, unlike any other country in the world, has really channeled technology for its own authoritarian ends. I think it's done a better job in terms of investing in artificial intelligence, in the local Internet of Things industry, and in really understanding the ways that they can control technology, but then not only passively use it to protect the country from outside influences, but actively use it to further the government's consolidation over society. So on that note, perhaps we can start talking about China.
Great. So Larry, dive into the domestic or foreign influence.
No. I'm going to talk about China.
Yeah, I mean the Chinese and the domestic authoritarianism.
I think the domestic aspects are actually well understood. There's been a lot of writing about the social credit system, about the frightening Orwellian expansion of camera surveillance, about the leaps forward in facial recognition. China leads the world in this technology now, and about the integration of these and many other methods into truly an Orwellian state. I mean, they're well on their way to a certain version of 1984. But the points I want to make are really, it's worse than you described. And it's worse than you described because what China is doing is not simply creating an Orwellian technological state within the boundaries of the People's Republic of China, nor simply selling and enthusiastically dispersing this technology to other authoritarian states around the world. I believe I have spent a year deeply immersed in a study that's coming out in late November on China's influence operations around the world and in the United States. And we've also had a study at the National Endowment for Democracy on sharp power, which I urge you to Google. Just Google sharp power National Endowment for Democracy, and you'll get the concept, which is both a Russian and Chinese way of extending power around the world through projection that isn't military, it isn't soft power, but it's very penetrating, coercive, corrupt, and compromising of democracy. I think it's not just that they've gone from defense to offense, okay? The defense was the great firewall and trying to purge content that is they view as harmful to Chinese Communist Party sustained rule from the internet. The offense is all of the proactive activities we've been hearing about that have also dispersed around the world. It's that they've gone from national to global, and their goal is no longer what it was or was seen to be for a long period of time, which was simply to develop the country and defend the unchallenged hegemony of the Chinese Communist Party. Their goal now, I think we've got to face it. This is a radical statement. I think it is a defensible statement, is regional and global dominance. It is global dominance of all of these technologies If you doubt it, read the Defense Innovation Unit report, China's Technology Transfer Strategy, which is the single scariest document I have ever read about any global challenge other than, bird flu or climate change. And, you'll see where they're headed. When you put this together with something else that I think you guys must wrestle with in whatever future iteration of this report and your recommendations that you roll out, there is just no separation meaningfully, ultimately, between all of these Chinese technology companies and the Chinese Communist Party state. They may pursue profit, they may pursue innovation, they may operate like Google and Facebook. When the party says, hand over your data, when the party says, serve our interests, they have no option but to comply. And this is very different than Google, Facebook, Twitter, and everything else. And the result is that there is a level of integration between all of the Chinese pseudo-private companies, the telecoms, the internet platforms, and so on, and the Chinese Communist Party states' strategic activities in a number of respects. One of these is the insatiable quest for data for commercial advantage, to get better algorithms and to become the leader in artificial intelligence, which they're rapidly becoming. A while ago, I heard one of the most important figures in the Silicon Valley from one of the three most important companies in the Silicon Valley, but it was Chatham House rules, so I'm not allowed to say which one, say we're 6 months ahead of the Chinese in artificial intelligence. And that was a year and a half ago. I don't even know if that advantage prevails. So there's the search for commercial advantage, scientific advantage in terms of artificial intelligence. There's the search simply for data on individuals and all of their behavior. They are assembling through facial recognition and acquisition of data through a variety of means, some of them deeply covert, frankly, information on all of us, which will help them not only commercially, but I think their goal is geopolitically. When I spoke about this last year to a group of congressional staffers who were very worried about, one of them told me about the Chinese purchase of a digital company called Grindr. Anybody know what Grindr is? It's the largest digital gay dating site in the world. And many of the people who frequent this site are not out. They're living covert lives. Well, congratulations. All your data is now owned by the Chinese Communist Party. Think about that. And of course, they're trying to swallow up now all sorts of digital companies around the world to get at their data. And this is the world we're living in. You mentioned in your report, you might have as well, their effort to acquire and build the telecom infrastructure around airports around the world. Well, why do you think they're doing that? It's not generosity of spirit to enable cities that happen to be near airports, including one very near here, by the way, that almost agreed to do this before they woke up to the subterranean motive. Obviously, there's something strategic that's going on here. So I've got another section here. I'm just going to switch to the bottom line. I think, we need much more explicit policies than what you guys are recommending. We need policies that are going to inform companies and societies around the world about the real motives of Chinese digital engagement, corporate infrastructure building, and so on and so forth. We need to fight China's data localization requirements, but that's going to be very difficult. We need to block China's acquisition of any more U.S. data companies, period. And fortunately, the Defense Authorization Act this year has expanded the writ of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States that's going to enable that to happen, but it's too late for some people whose data now are firmly in control of the Chinese Communist Party. I think no Chinese telecom company should be allowed to build any 5G network or, frankly, any other telecom infrastructure in the United States, because any such construction is going to be immediately sent back to supercomputers in the People's Republic of China. And finally, I think we need to support around the world internet freedom advocacy and monitoring organizations. This is something I think you're very much on top of, that are going to wake up to this and all of the things around us. We've got maybe 5 to 8 years to win this battle before it's completely lost. And China is the digital superpower of the world, with databases and surveillance mechanisms, not only for their own people, and not only for the people of Zimbabwe and Venezuela and all the other corrupt autocracies that are selling their souls to the Chinese Communist Party state, but for all the democracies of the world that they're penetrating and investing in.
Well, this is why I love Larry. He can count on him for a clear clarion call and a lot of passion and a lot of real data. I mean, you're reminding me of the arguments you and Michael Chertoff made in your Washington Post op-ed just a couple days ago, where you're talking about all the infrastructure that's being built around the world and just what Larry's talking about. So I'm going to have to say, I'll tell you what we're going to do. I want to say we had an embarrassment of riches here. We could have had one of these themes, one of these people. This is always the way it is, but you're all awesome. We are going to stop the live stream now, and then we're going to have a reception outside, but we're going to ask everybody to just join us and continue the conversation.